pass us something?
No, it's okay. Oh.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second evening tonight in our Black Excellence in Art series featuring Gordon Shadrach. I just want to do a quick little intro to Gordon. He was born and raised in Brampton and has lived in Toronto for over 25 years. He started painting in 2013 and he's exhibited in solo and group shows in Canada and the US. In 2018, one of his paintings was chosen to be an exhibit at the ROM called Here We Are Here, Black Canadian Contemporary Art. That exhibit went on tour across the country. Gordon is active as an artist in various community initiatives and has been featured on programs like TVO's The Agenda and CBC's Metro Morning. Thank you, Gordon. I'm just going to quickly do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge today that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit peoples. But yeah, thank you, Gordon, for joining us today. We're really excited to have you, and I just think that your art is so beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will now pass it over to you. I'm going to pin you so that you are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for coming and thank you for having me. I really appreciate this. It's always nice to talk about my art. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to specifically focus on to talk about, but I thought, I like talking about myself. So I'll just talk about myself. And I'll talk a little bit about my journey as an artist and why representation in art is so important and how I got to where I am right now. So I have a slideshow that I'm going to be sharing with you, and it's going to show some of my work. But if you have any questions and you want to engage with any discussion, please raise your hand and the moderators will let you know that, or let me know, and we can have a conversation. So I'm prepared to stop at any time. As much as I like talking about my own work, I get tired of talking about myself pretty quickly. So if you want to ask a question, I'm totally open to that. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yes, excellent. All right, so I'm calling this race and representation because when we think about art and we think about Canadian, specifically when we think about the Canadian art world, we tend to think of Canada as being this very welcoming country, and in many ways it is, but there are also narratives that we don't really hear about. And my experiences as an artist have been immensely positive, but there's been some instances where I've recognized that some of the pervasive racism or discrimination that we might experience in general life actually also permeates into the art world, and how that impacts art appreciation for all people, not just Black people or marginalized people. So the best way to start off, I think, is to start off with me. Okay. As a little guy. This is little Gordon, and he shows up in some of my Instagram feeds, and I think it's always really interesting for me to think back to my childhood, because there's a certain, if I could tell little Gordon where I am today, he would never believe me, because this was not part of the path. This was not part of the plan to become an artist. I became an artist by accident. Not it was like growing up in the 70s and 80s. As mentioned, I was born in Brampton and I was raised in Brampton. And it was an interesting time to grow up in Brampton. It was predominantly a white city. There weren't very many people of color. I was usually one of the only Black children in my class. I have 3 older brothers, so often they would represent the other Black children in the school. Both my parents were teachers as well, so they taught at different schools. But I didn't really have a chance to really meet a lot of other kids who looked like me based on where I lived and the time period in which we were living. So I was raised, as I said, by two parents who were teachers. In particular, my dad was really into critical thinking, although we didn't call it critical thinking at the time. But he really encouraged his sons to really question a lot of what we saw. And what we didn't see. So if we were watching TV, we would look for representation on TV characters, and we realized that there weren't a lot of Black people on TV. Or when you did see Black people, they were often impoverished or they were often criminals. So, we'd see these sitcoms and these stories and these movies where we never really saw ourselves in a positive light. And if we did see someone who was noble, it was often someone who was there to die willingly so that the white protagonist can survive. So it was like the Black lives were very disposable, according to pop culture, and that's what we grew up seeing, and that's what we grew up realizing and learning. And as Black children, and I think a lot of marginalized children, you end up having conversations with your parents that are pretty serious in tone about um, the realities of growing up Black or looking different in a community that's predominantly white. So I often reflect on the fact that um, a lot of Black children, their childhood is in some ways, I wouldn't say shortened, but it is not as expansive with the idea of what it's like to be a child, because we're taught very important lessons that will ideally help survive as we grow older. So we've always been taught about how to deal with the police and how to respond to figures of authority. So these are all things that we were indoctrinated with as children, because we knew that these were potential life and death matters. And this was, 1972, where we still have where we had these conversations, and we can see that these conversations are still important today. So my parents were very progressive. They encouraged me to study art. They encouraged me to study fashion. You can see I was very experimental with my fashion at the age of 5. But I felt as I got older that I had to find work that was more um, that was more fiscally responsible than studying art or fashion. And also, to be quite honest, there weren't a lot of people that looked like me in the art field. So even though I was very much into art, I didn't really think it was going to be a viable way to go. So eventually I ended up going to OCA before it was OCAD, and I studied something called textile design, with the idea of being an illustrator and a fashion illustrator specifically. But that led me into working in display and marketing. And so I abandoned my artistic endeavors for a few years. And then eventually I became a teacher, and eventually I became an artist. And the art thing started completely by accident. My partner dared me to do some paintings, and I did, and then I just haven't stopped painting. So I started painting in 2013, and I haven't stopped. So be careful when you start a hobby. It may take over your life and lead you down a path that you weren't planning. So I wanted to just briefly talk about what type of art I do. I am a portrait artist, and in order, just making sure that we understand that portraiture is generally paintings of real people, and it's representative of them. And I use this as a sort of classic painting that, when we think of portraiture, we usually think of these classical paintings. And I once when I was doing a presentation to a group of students, I Googled, best painted portraits, in history. And when you Google that, you never see a painting of a Black person. And you never see any sort of representation of work done by Black artists or artists that aren't European. And so when you Google that, and when you see all these paintings and these works and these artists that are held in such a high regard, and you don't see any diversity in that, you are getting a very clear message. And one of those messages is that your work doesn't have value but not only that, you start to realize that maybe it's more than that. It might be even how your culture of your background as diasporic people, you aren't as important. Because when we look at the stories of in that we see, or the paintings we see in art history, it's obviously very Eurocentric, and I get that, because they're the books that we look at are written by Europeans and people of European descent. But at some point, there needs to be an expansion of what qualifies as art. And the thing is, there was experimental art, and there were different ways of looking at art over the periods of time. I chose this next slide as an example. It's a little silly, but it is, a serious painting by an Italian artist named Giuseppe. I've just blanked out on his last name. I'll just show it though. Giuseppe Ercamboldo, and he's famous for making portraits of faces with fruits and vegetables. And this is from 1591. And one of the magazines that I look, or one of the websites that I looked at, included this as their one of their top paintings historically of a portrait. And there was in that list, we could include people made out of fruits and vegetables, but we couldn't include people who had brown or darker skin. So it's a really fascinating way to look at life, that you're completely erased, and that's what a lot of art has done. It's erased the voices and the narratives told by Black people, by people who aren't European descent. And so by doing portraits of Black people, when I started painting Black people, I started to realize that it became inherently political, and that just by putting a Black person in a painting, it immediately became a political statement, regardless of what my intent was. People were putting some sort of weight and some sort of um, concept that I might not even considered behind what I was doing. And it just goes to show you that, as Black people, we often are. I was raised to be very self-aware of how I was being perceived in public spaces. When I maneuver through spaces, you're aware that people are looking at you. I'm particularly tall. I'm 6'4", so I've been told for my whole life, stand up tall, always look like you belong where you are, because there are people who are going to think that you don't. And so when you start creating paintings and you realize that that sort uh, of of thinking is being applied to your work when you had no intention to apply that, you realize, okay, this is a thing. You know, this isn't just me. This is like a thing that's bigger than I can control. So we'll get into what I started off with painting. So because of this whole concept of not really feeling comfortable presenting myself as a portrait painter, and also not really feeling comfortable that there was even any interest or value in Black portraiture, when I started painting and started doing art fairs, I tried to come up with themes that I could work with. And since a lot of my interest was in fashion, I started doing fashion paintings that were fashion, based on fashion. And so I started doing these shoe portraits, and they were quite popular. I actually did quite well. And eventually, when I transitioned away from them, I had a lot of people saying, when are you going to do the shoes again? I love the shoes, but I just headed in a different direction. And what I liked about the shoe paintings initially was I liked that there was a neutrality behind them. Aside from this one, pause, where you can see the person's hand, um, the portraits that I'm showing could be anybody. It could be any gender. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, um, it could be any race. We read them as male, we read them as masculine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a cis male wearing them. So it's all these things that I thought that they were open um, to interpretation. And I like the neutrality because I thought, well, I'm still doing my art and I'm reaching a wider audience. And then I started to start inserting some Blackness into my work. Oh, before I get to that, before I get into the Blackness that I've inserted, I also want to show this painting, because this painting to me is called Midway. And I always kind of imagine it as someone on a midway ride, like, and the legs are kind of freely swinging in the air, or someone sitting on a ledge and halfway up or halfway down in a jump or something. But I always read it as a positive painting. And as I mentioned, I started doing art fairs as a way of selling my work and getting my name out there. And I was told by an art patron that my shoe paintings made him think of lynchings because I was a black painter and they were feet suspended. And
Mm.
that was when I really realized how much um, the fact that I am a black person, people can really project a lot of things. This man was just telling me how uncomfortable they made him. They really made him think about lynching and people being hung, and which was the exact opposite. I was seeing these paintings of elation and joy and freedom. So maybe he had his own issues, but it is something. When I did art fairs, especially, I met a lot of people in the public, and I really loved getting feedback from them. It informed my practice. It really inspired me in a lot of ways, but it also did surprise me when I would hear things like that, like things that I hadn't anticipated. And I remember, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to just jump in. So this is where I was going next. So this is a portrait where I started inserting some blackness in it, where there is no face still. And part of that was because I actually wasn't entirely comfortable and confident with my skills as an artist to paint faces, which is why it's absolutely hilarious that I'm a portrait painter. Yeah, it's kind of silly, but I ended up becoming a portrait painter. I ended up becoming a portrait painter who hates painting hands and feet, and I paint hands, feet, and faces. So I don't know how that happened, but this was a nice segue into recognizing that there were people interested in work that represented Black people. Even though, as I said, they're subtle or smaller instances here. I met these gentlemen at the Toronto Artist Project, and they are Black men, and they saw my work hanging in my booth, and they were so thrilled to see portraits of Black people at an art fair because they hadn't experienced it before. And to be quite honest, meeting those three gentlemen completely changed the course of my life, because that's when I thought I can really do something with my art beyond just making work that I think is beautiful or work that I really enjoy. I realized that we live in Canada, and when you think about Canadian art, we always have this typical single minded view of what Canadian art is. And it usually doesn't involve diversity, unless, of course, it's looking at Inuit art or First Nations art, and then that has its own sort of segment. Is that included in the broad landscape of what we see as Canadian art? These are questions that I've often asked. But recognizing that I didn't see Black faces in art, and these guys were freaking out that they didn't see Black faces in art. And I thought, it's time to get off the pot. Like, I was raised that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. But I have to say that with the caveat that I was also working as a full-time teacher. So having a full-time job meant that I wasn't dependent on my art to pay my bills and to keep me going. I could experiment and do the type of art that I wanted to do, knowing that if it didn't sell, it'd be, a little disappointing emotionally, but I would still survive. If I was depending on just doing portraiture of Black people and not having any other way of making money, then it would have been too big of a risk for me to have gone that route. So when I started doing more portraiture, I started looking at history and art history, and started looking at how there are these gaps of the placement. There are these gaps in history that don't show Black people, and often when you do see Black people in classical paintings, it's as a background addition or some way of showing the 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 importance of the white sitter, and the black person is often there to serve them in the background. So it was unlikely to see, portraits of up into Edwardian times, like seeing portraits of paintings and photographs of black people that were focused solely on them. So I did this painting, and it was a really important painting for me because I started explaining with the idea of history. So I started inserting black men into historical clothing, because I wanted to see what it'd be like to also go back in time and take away the restrictions that black people would have had placed upon their bodies, including how they groom themselves, by putting them in contemporary hair, like giving them dreadlocks, giving them afros, things that they wouldn't have been allowed to have had they lived in, in Western society in those time periods. And it was a really, it was a very fulfilling journey doing those things. I really, really loved it. It felt like it was a really nice way to sort of enter this forum and have my own unique perspective on it. But this painting was a lot for me, because then I learned something about the gaze. And the gaze being, of course, where the eyes of the sitter are positioned in the painting, and how, they look right at you. People always talk about Mona Lisa's, gaze, and how it moves with you and all that sort of stuff. But I realized, or I was being told by some people, that they were uncomfortable by having my sitters looking directly at them. And the people that were uncomfortable with that were white people. They were telling me they didn't feel comfortable with the way that my sitters were looking at them, and that has been ingrained in North American and Western society and culture, that black people are expected to avert their eyes. That's part of subservience. That's going back to slavery. And here it is, this was in 2016. People are starting to give me, grief about the fact that they're uncomfortable that a black man in a painting is looking at them. And one of the people that spoke to me about that in particular was an art consultant. I was at the Toronto Outdoor Art Exhibition, and he was an art consultant, and he was talking to me about my work. And he told me that this painting would never sell because it would make too many people uncomfortable. And so when we look at this woman, her gaze isn't that dissimilar to what his is, but it just goes to show you the amount of luggage and baggage that people bring, and they don't even recognize how they've been so indoctrinated with racism that they can tell me something like that and not even recognize what they're saying. They have no clue that they're saying something offensive or why it's offensive. And so I've got this next slide showing these are the words that I get from this. I've been told about this sitter, that he's confrontational, that he's defiant. Defiant is often used for describing black people who um, aren't subverting themselves in some way, if they show what's perceived as dominance and they're being defiant. He's angry, he's confident, he's too direct. And confidence as well is something that, even though I was told to always look confident, being too confident could actually get me in trouble as a black man, because then people wonder what you're up to. And so confidence can also be seen as a negative with black men, which is ridiculous. This is one of my other portraits that I absolutely love. And again, the words were defiant, confident, indifferent, distant, arrogant. And I like this portrait because I think he looks like he's relaxed. When I painted, I thought this is a person who's, I don't smoke, but but I was like, this is a person who's like relaxed. He's just taking a breath after doing something, and then hearing this. And again, these words are coming to me from white people. So when we talk about this as a theme about looking about Black excellence in art, you have to recognize that Black excellence means telling people, I'm not going to listen to you, or I'm going to fight against what you're telling me in order for me to do the work that I want to do. So, when we talk about Black excellence and encouraging that in youth, it's not a matter of just saying, work hard. because you are going to be told as a Black person that your work doesn't have value, or it's offensive, or it's hurtful, or whatever it is. And it's happening to young Black artists now in school and post-secondary. I worked with a lot of them, and a lot of them are dropping out of post-secondary art programs because their instructors have no clue how to interpret their work. And if they do interpret it, they interpret it in a negative way. Which leads me to interpretation of work. So this was the painting that I did for the ROM. So in 2018, the ROM put together a show called Here We Are Here, and it was about Black contemporary art. And it was their way of making amends for a show that they had done in the late 1990s, called Of Africa, where they basically did um, an exhibition that was about Africa told from the colonialist point of view. And there were actual pickets at that show. And it was poorly thought out, and it took them years to make amends, and they wanted to do it right. So they did a lot of work, and they called an artist, and I was lucky enough to get the call to be a participating artist in the show. And it was exciting for me because most of the art I was still doing, I was just selling from art fairs. I didn't get representation from a commercial art gallery. And so with the expectation of being in the ROM, I thought, whoop, the doors are opening. And they didn't. So I don't know what typically happens to artists when they show in a major institution like the ROM. But as a Black artist, and the artists who were in the show who I met had already told me, don't get your hopes up that a gallery is going to come and try to snatch you up and represent you. Um, it's not going to happen. And they were absolutely right. So despite showing at the ROM, I expected my life to sort of take a turn. And it did in some ways that were quite positive. I think that's when I learned how to talk about my art. And that's when I started doing more events where I spoke about art. And it definitely did give me confidence, but it didn't open the doors that I thought it would open for sure. And it was a very interesting year that year too, because even though I was accepted to in the Toronto Outdoor Art Exhibition, which I mentioned earlier, and that's where I got the feedback about the gaze of my sitter, I had applied to be in the Toronto Art Exhibition, which is a major exhibition that happens at City Hall every year, for 2018, and I was rejected. So in the same year that I had a painting in the ROM, I was rejected from being in a local art fair. And so when we talk about being a successful Black artist, and we talk about Black excellence, it's all relative. I've been going to that art fair for my entire adult life. I had applied for years when I started painting, and I finally got in one year, and then, as I said, I got rejected. But art is subjective, and I get it, and I totally understand that. But when I spoke to some very respectable Black curators in the city and people who were highly involved, they just blatantly called it racism, because the package that I put together for that year was primarily Black men in my portraits. The year I was accepted, there were some shoes and there were some Black men. And the year that I applied with just my portraits of Black men, I was rejected. And so, you know, again, what are you fighting for? What do you got? Like, what are you fighting against? It was always a reason to fight. And anytime that I was rejected, it just made me work harder and push harder. And, you know, it's depressing, but as I said, because I had the opportunities, I have a supportive partner, I had a job, it allowed me to have the freedom to continue on this path. And I'm really glad I did. So next we have, I just wanted to I know we're moving through this a little slow, and I'm sorry if I've been doing a lot of talking, but I just want to talk a little bit about how, um, when we talked about the stoicism of my sitters before of trying to remain neutral, um, and after being, rejected from the raw from the Toronto Outdoor Art Exhibition, again, it's always about reflection. And I thought, so uh, as Black people, we're often encouraged to remain stoic in situations of high stress, if I'm stopped by the police, I have to remain very calm. I can't get angry at a police officer for stopping me. I have to stay calm. I have to retain a certain composure. And I started reflecting on how, despite the fact that I had sitters that were showing that stoicism, primarily white viewers of my work were saying that they were putting all these emotions on them that were usually s- um, about anger or something. And I thought, well, maybe I should start painting people who look angry. Uh, if they're going to say that they're angry anyway. And I thought, Black people have a lot to be angry about. So I did a portrait series called Visceral, and I wanted to show a range of different types of emotional response to racism. So I actually sat down with people and I photographed them, and we talked about our racism that we've experienced, and I talked about microaggressions and macroaggressions. And while I was talking to them, I took shots of them, and that ended up becoming this show. And I ended up doing two series within that show where I did the hidden and the scene. And so the scene was when people were actually showing their expressions, and the hidden series of this show were all hoodies, and you couldn't see the sitters' faces. And I wanted there to be an expressiveness, either just from the posture or from the color that I used. The hoodie series were all named just after colors of each hoodie, because every hoodie was a different color. But I really wanted it to be about expressing some sort of emotion. And it does get a little boring painting stoicism all the time anyway, but it was a really good show, and I'm really glad I did it. And there was a good response to it. And I think, again, everything that I experienced kind of leads to the next thing. And it's always about thinking back about what I've learned, thinking about the experiences, and also thinking about how my exchanges with different people. And that is ultimately um, what drives my inspiration. So often my partner says I'm a little bit, he thinks I'm a little scattered sometimes because my themes keep changing and evolving really quickly. They're slowing down now. I'm getting older. But my interactions with people really, really help direct the narratives of the work that I'm doing. So I'm going to give you a trigger warning. There is a word on the next slide that is problematic, but it's kind of important for what we're talking about. So I'm going to be showing two paintings that I did, and beside each painting is an actual product that existed in history. I did a show called Net Worth, and it was about Black masculinity and perception of strength, and how that strength can be used by people for their own benefits while keeping other people down. And so you may or may not know, but if you think, before I get to what you may or may not know, if you just think about mascots of products, so we have things like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, and there was like a recent kerfuffle about how those are racist stereotypes and how they need to we need to move forward as society. Well, there were ones that were way worse than that. And so in North America there were tons of products that used Black faces and Black bodies in such derogatory ways in order to promote their product. And often it was to show that they were hardworking or good products. I'm going to be showing you two products. One is a cleaning product where they have a Black man and he's scrubbing the window, and it's showing how strong this cleaning product is because it's got a Black man cleaning it, so it's got to be good work. And then there's a chewing tobacco. They're both from around the same time period, or around 1920s. I have a collection of Black ephemera, and I've used some of that stuff to inspire some of my work. And so the chewing tobacco can, it might be hard for you to see on the screen anyway, has the word, it is the N word. And it is not, but this was an actual product that sat in shelves and was sold openly. And so we'll move to that slide. So here I have a detail of the painting that I did that was inspired by this one, which is called Vim and Vigor. And this is the Negro powder that they sold. It was actually called Negro powder. And then this is a painting I did called Smoke and Chew. And then this is the tobacco and the image that they use to promote the tobacco. And so, what makes this particularly sad is that this is at the tip of the iceberg of the type of representation that Black people would have seen of themselves. They would have seen themselves as these cartoonish figures that were mocked, elements of them to be ashamed of. And when we think about how racism persists in society today, we need to recognize that these things have existed in our culture for such a long time that they do still to this day impact people's views on how they treat other people. There is a way of diminishing the other, and that's what this is an example of. And so it's hard to accept sometimes, but it really is just like the idea of the eye contact thing. That these are things that are sort of embedded in our culture. So this is what I did. I try to take these negative images and turn them into something positive. This is actually a painting of a slave, an enslaved man that I've changed, I've altered him, I've given him a shirt, I've given him his dignity, and this is one that's celebrating the idea of the natural hair. So instead of the hair being something that's a problem or something that's made fun of, it's something that is celebrated. In that same show, I started exploring history and I started looking at the ideas of um, the Black Loyalists, who were formerly enslaved men who fought with the British in the American Civil War with the promise of freedom, which didn't pan out so well. Some of it ended up in Africville. If you don't know Africville in Nova Scotia, it is worth looking up and learning about. And it shows the longevity of Black people in Canada and the history that I never learned as a child about Black people in Canada, and that I'm happy to say that some students are learning now. But I think it's still a hidden history, the history of the Black Loyalists and um, the of Africville. And I've taken this idea of the Black Loyalists and I've made them into a sports team as a way of sort of taking this concept of being this commodity that's being used to, in this case, the sports teams, the athletes actually do of course make money, but to me there's still a bit of a problematic idea when you think about trading players and all these sorts of things. The language is a bit problematic for me. So this is 2020, and these paintings were painted obviously after the pandemic started and after George Floyd. And it was, a time when a lot of Black people had been speaking up and being put down for a number of years for speaking about politics. And of course, we look to people that we consider our leaders, and those would be a lot of the sports stars. And so what I did was I took sports equipment and turned them into face masks. So I have the Air Jordan shoe, I have a basketball, and I have a football. And the idea of the mask being something that's supposed to keep us safe and keep us alive, but at the same time in these cases they're muzzling people from being able to speak clearly, they're limiting how they can breathe. um, it was the first time I'd actually started doing paintings that were directly connected to current events and what was happening in the world, and it felt very cathartic, especially because I really didn't want to do any work at all when the pandemic started. I was not feeling creative. I wasn't feeling any sort of need for or figuring out how I could use art as a release. But then with 2020 and the George Floyd, um, it I had this sort of moment of clarity of how I could represent what was happening in the world. And these are paintings that still mean a lot to me. Um, because of the impact that they had, not just on myself, but on a lot of people who had the opportunity to see them and the feedback I got from them. And that was one of the things that I didn't expect as an artist, was to realize that your work affects people in good ways as well, that it becomes meaningful to them. And that was a bit of an adjustment for me. Like it was a bit of an adjustment for me to learn that people are talking about my artwork in Black History Month, across the TDSB, former students saying, "Hey, they talked about you in our announcements this morning." I was like, "What?" So, but it also goes to show you that there is a need for more Black representation, because there are Black artists who have been in this country for a long time. I've only recently started learning about them. And so there's so much that it remains hidden and untaught that really needs to change. So, which brings me up to my last show, which I just did. It was called Trade, and it involved the idea of the Black loyalists. I did two storylines. I did one that focused on my sports team, and then I did one that was an imagining of what it would be like to be a formerly enslaved person on your journey to what was supposed to be freedom. And so I did a series of paintings that just showed different parts of a narrative that I created for myself for imagining the story. I don't want to romanticize being enslaved or being formerly enslaved or being in the army or being forced to fight, but I felt like there were some images in my head that I really wanted to get at about what I was imagining life would have been like. And I can come full circle by saying that one of the challenges as an artist, or one of my goals as an artist, um, was to get representation from a gallery, which I did do. So I'm with a gallery called United Contemporary, and with being as represented by a gallery, it allows you to really work on a body of work that can tell a story. And I joined them in 2019, I believe, and so it's been really helpful for me to develop as an artist. And so many Black artists in Toronto and in Canada are not represented by galleries in Canada. They're just not. They're not. Their work isn't validated. It's not seen as having value. Black gallery or gallerists, sorry, white gallerists don't think they can tell the stories of what the artists are trying to say, and so it just becomes ignored. But since I've been with United, I've been able to really flesh out and develop my artwork, and it's really grown so quickly in my conceiving of ideas and how to execute them, and knowing that I have a space to hang them has really made a big difference. And this is a long-winded way of saying also that I did eventually reach one of my other goals, which was this. I am now in a national, or I'm in an art institution. So this painting Trade was actually bought by the Art Gallery of Hamilton. It's actually was being hung today, according to the curator there. And so this was something I never would have imagined when I started on this little journey, that I would go start from painting bow ties and shoes to having my work being hung, being purchased as part of their permanent collection at the Art Gallery of Hamilton. So it's been a really fun ride. It's been challenging, but what I love about what I've been able to experience is that I've been able to meet and experience uh, growth of younger artists and emerging artists, and I knowing that my presence has made other Black artists' work visible has really made the struggles worth it. And that's what I realized while I was doing this, that this isn't just about getting my work and meeting my little dreams. It's really about creating a difference and allowing other people to follow in those steps and to have less of a struggle to get where they want to go. And that's what I would like to say.
That's
No,
beautiful.
I'm getting applause. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a comment or question, I guess. So you'd mentioned earlier that that Black like high school students are sometimes like dropping out of art class or whatever, they're dropping their art because their teachers can't understand their art.
Yeah.
Um and I guess I just have this different impression of the upcoming generations where they don't give a flying fig about what old people think. And so I guess it surprises me that it would matter to them so much what, their teacher has to say about their art, or that they can't interpret it or how they're interpreting it. I guess I'm
Well,
surprised about that.
what you're saying, and I mean no disrespect in this, is the perspective of privilege.
Yeah.
Because as students, especially and it's specifically, it does affect high school students, but I'm talking mostly post-secondary students that I've met that have dropped out. Their instructors are their gatekeepers. They're the first gatekeepers that they're meeting. And so when they meet these gatekeepers who are saying, your work is confusing or your work's going to upset people. Like I went, there's the dean of design at OCAD University is this, a black woman named Dr. Dean Dory, and she does a Black Excellence tour of the grad show. So very quickly, so I was looking at an illustrator's work, and there was this one painting that I absolutely loved. It was this illustration she had done, and it was a black man on his hands and knees, and it had sugar cane growing out of his back. And she was doing this whole thing about the sugar trade and the sugar industry and how much that's impacted the world, but also how, how it affected the Black diaspora. And I was like, this is an amazing illustration. It has struck me. It stopped me in my tracks. And she said, well, I'm glad you like it. My instructor told me that to pull it from my show because it was too macabre. So when you're graduating and you've created something that is so poignant, it has so much meaning, and the person that you're expecting to lead you tells you that you need to take that out of your show, you can say, I don't give a flying fig, but these are the guys that are these are the men and women who are supposed to be guiding you towards a career. And when you don't have any other um, role models or you don't see yourself in those higher levels, you listen to it because you're being told something that you actually already believe about yourself. So no matter how much your parents love you and tell you positive things and you can do what you want to do, the more I've spoken to artists, Black artists, the more I've seen that a lot of them have a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure because they have never really gotten that reinforcement from the people who can really control that future for them. And so when you see, someone is like, well, I don't really care. And often like when I was in art school doing textile design, and I'd see the fine art students and they were mostly white, sort of, depressive sort of people. I'm like, I don't have time to be moody. Like I've got to have, I'm working almost full-time hours and, trying to figure out what I'm doing here. And, I don't have time to like, talk about ennui. Like this isn't going to happen. And so, there is, I'm speaking in stereotypes, but I am talking about this. There is a perspective on who gets to do what. And to be able to break those rules and to push past those people, that's a narrative that we see often in stories that are told about white rebellious people. If we look at stories of Black rebellious people, even if we look at real stories, they're often retold so that there's a white element of someone who helps guide them. Like in the story of the Green Book, for example, that narrative completely changed. So like there's this whole concept of how when you see that, and as a Black person, it again feeds that narrative of, oh, I guess we weren't good enough on our own anyway. And it's not necessarily something that you literally think those things to yourself. It just kind of feeds into this feeling that you've been confronted with your whole life. So no offense, but I just meant like that's just part of the mentality.
No, that's totally fair. All of that's totally justified, and like it just goes to show like that white supremacy is just everywhere, and it breaks my heart how internalized
Yeah.
that is for all of us, but like particularly for Black kids and Black young people just still trying to shake that stuff off. Like it's just
Yeah.
so inside.
Yeah, I think my experiences with the art world has been pretty um, alarming to me. And art lovers, I've dealt with some people who just are, again, as I said, like not just like an art consultant. I've had people at art fairs just say things to me or that are just wrong. And so when you think about the art world and you think about art people and all that sort of stuff, you think it's all kumbaya. And it's not. It's a very closed system. It's a very narrow system that is just starting to expand. and grow. There is a privilege of being an artist in Canada, which I totally am grateful to be a part of, but I also do recognize that it is a very closed ecosystem, uh, and it doesn't really allow for new biodiversity within it. So it really is like my last show was pretty successful. I had a really good buzz about it, and it was sold out, and it was weird for me because I have been focusing on fighting against something for so long. It was weird to just all of a sudden feel like, oh, I actually did something successfully. So because that push is what kind of spurs you on. And so it was this weird kind of like, I was actually just talking about this with another woman the other day or today. She just said she reached this pinnacle where she realized that she had to acknowledge that things she was being successful. And it's such a weird thing to have to acknowledge, and that you can just work now on what you want to work on, without really feeling like you have to speak for a whole bunch of other people. Are there any other questions or comments?
I think here, my husband's coming, sorry.
Okay, it's
But
okay.
I really love
Hi there,
to start
wonderful. Really enjoyed your kind of
explanation within,
explanation and
yeah.
analysis of everything. I have a
Thanks.
question. When's your next show?
My next show is August 1st. Yeah, and my next show is going to be with the city of Toronto. So that's why I've actually been able to leave teaching, is because I actually got this. I'm on a leave of teaching right now. And so my next show is, I'm not supposed to really talk too much about it, but basically it's a historic home and museum in Toronto, and I've been given the opportunity to decolonize it. And so I'm going to be inserting my paintings in a Victorian space, an Edwardian space, and sort of playing with history. And so I'm doing sort of like this Afrofuturism sort of reimagining of looking at how Toronto was actually very progressive in the 1900s with emancipation, but a lot of that went by the wayside. Like a lot of progress that was made at a certain point was just wiped out. And so the narrative that I'm working on is sort of reimagining if the progress wasn't wiped out. So it's looking at yeah, so it's looking at different ideas of beauty and art and how that can be presented. So it's a really exciting. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'm actually sort of working as a curator as well, so I'm bringing in other artists as well to tell stories. So I'm really, really thrilled with it.
And sorry, for how long will it be going on?
That starts August 1st, and there will be an opening weekend for 3 days that weekend, and I think the show should be on for 6 months. So yeah, so it's going to be something that people will have an opportunity to visit and tour and see.
Sorry, and you said that's at the city of Toronto?
Yeah.
Okay, so city hall then.
No, it's
No?
in a museum,
Oh,
within a
museum,
museum.
Yeah, so Toronto, the city of Toronto owns a bunch of historic homes and museums, and so they're working on these different programs. There's a program called Awakenings, and they're looking at sort of injecting some different life into them to appeal to a broader audience and to make more marginalized people feel welcome in those spaces. And so this is going to be part of that program.
Cool.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Um,
Yes.
Gordon, I think if you think to, when you have information about the show, if you want to share that back with us, we would share that with the community and make sure that we
Sure.
get it out.
I'd love to. I think actually this program is actually going to be open to schools as well. So it'd be great to see if Blake could go and the students could go as well.
Field trips.
Yay.
Field trips again.
Hopefully. Okay. Are there any other questions? No? Okay. Well, this was a pleasure. I'm sorry for just talking the whole time. But I hope
Honestly, I could listen to you talk for hours. I think you are wonderful.
No, I'm on my side. I really enjoy the explanation behind the paintings. I mean, in general, whatever painting I look at, I always like to have the painter perspective, right? Because sometimes, what you think you're seeing is not what was meant to be, I don't know, told. I don't know.
but I actually really like it when people see their own things when it's positive. So, so yeah, I think it's I think, you know, painting, I might have an idea when I'm doing a painting, but I think paintings should, or art should, encourage questions, and should have you or coming up with your own decisions about what you're seeing. I don't think there should be a complete answer to a painting, because often I'll have an idea behind a painting, and then someone else will say something, and I'll say, "Oh my God, I didn't even think of that," and they've added this extra layer to the painting that is just so remarkable. And so I think it should be. It's good to know what the artist thinks, but I think it's also great to write your own narratives and come up with your own ideas around the work. Just don't think that there are people hanging from trees, please. Other than that, I'm good.
Thank you so much, Gordon. I really appreciated you giving us your perspective and your experiences and sharing that with us. And it was really great to hear all of that you shared tonight. And I'm really now curious to go and check out more of your work.
Okay, please do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Beautiful.
All right, thank you. All right, have a good night, everybody, then.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
All right, good night. Take
Good
care.
night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good night.
Bye.
Go to bed.
Go to bed.
That's true. Good point.
You gotta leave me.
Yeah, you don't